She told me to sit closer. I only agreed on one condition, that she wouldn't move away. The first time I saw her, I couldn't help but notice the quiet authority in her presence. She wasn't loud or commanding in the obvious way, it was subtle, a slight tilt of her head as she listened, the effortless way her hand moved when she adjusted a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the confident grace in her posture as she navigated the front of the lecture hall. My literature professor, at 42, had a presence that made the room feel warmer, somehow more alive. I walked in late that morning, my notebook clutched in one hand, and felt my pulse quicken as I scanned the rows for a seat. All the front seats were taken, save one in the center. It was closer than I'd normally dare, but something in her gaze, briefly meeting mine, felt like an unspoken invitation. I slid into the chair, careful not to draw attention, and immediately noticed the subtle warmth radiating from the classroom, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the smell of old books. It was comforting, grounding, and unexpectedly intimate. As she spoke, her voice was gentle yet deliberate, each word carrying a rhythm that demanded attention. I found myself leaning in, not just to hear the lecture better, but because I wanted to notice every little detail, the soft brush of her sleeve as she reached for a marker, the way sunlight caught the highlights in her hair, or how her fingers tapped lightly against the podium in a rhythm I could almost feel in my chest. My thoughts began wandering, hesitant and guilty, caught between admiration and an unfamiliar flutter of attraction. There was a moment, fleeting but significant, when she glanced in my direction. Our eyes met, and there was a fraction of a second that felt longer than it should, as if the room had contracted around us. She gave a small, knowing smile before turning back to the class. I couldn't tell if it was encouragement, amusement, or something else entirely, but it made my heart skip, and I felt a quiet thrill at being noticed. When the lecture ended, she paused at her desk, looking at the scattered students with a gentle, almost imperceptible gaze that made me wonder what she saw when she looked at me. And then she said it, softly enough that only I could have caught it, "Sit closer if you like." My chest tightened, not from boldness, but from the delicate tension of choice, the magnetic pull of something unspoken. That single invitation set the stage for everything to come, and I knew, without quite understanding why, that my life was about to tilt just a little closer toward hers. After that first invitation, I found myself choosing seats closer to her whenever possible. It wasn't just about being near her, it was about noticing, observing, and feeling the subtle rhythms of her presence. The gentle sway of her hair as she turned to write on the board, the quiet sigh when she paused to think, the way her fingers lingered on a page as she reviewed a student essay, it all drew me in, almost magnetically. Every small detail felt alive, weighted with significance, and yet utterly ordinary in a way that made it all the more mesmerizing. During one lecture, I hesitated before reaching for a textbook near her side. Our knees brushed lightly under the desk, a fleeting contact, barely there, yet it sent a quiet shiver through me. I glanced up, meeting her eyes for just a moment, and I swear I saw a flicker of acknowledgement, a subtle recognition that felt more intimate than anything either of us said aloud. I kept my attention split between the words she spoke and the rhythm of her presence, caught in a strange, exhilarating tension between admiration and something I couldn't quite name. Later, as she handed back papers, her hand brushed mine while passing a graded assignment. The touch was unremarkable to anyone else, but to me, it felt electric, not in a shocking way, but in a way that made the air between us warmer, denser, more charged. I noticed the soft scent of her perfume mingling with the crisp classroom air, the faint sound of her breath as she smiled politely at another student, the quiet tap of her pen against the desk. Every detail anchored me, pulling me closer to her in ways I hadn't expected. Our shared moments extended beyond the classroom. A brief discussion about a poem led to laughter that lingered longer than necessary, her eyes crinkling at the corners as if inviting me to lean in further. I felt a strange combination of exhilaration and restraint, aware of the boundaries we weren't crossing but intensely conscious of the magnetic pull between us. By the end of that day, I realized that the attraction wasn't just about desire, it was about attention, care, and noticing each other in ways the world often overlooked. Every brush of her hand, every shared glance, every unspoken acknowledgement built a connection deeper than the lecture hall itself. And in that quiet, ordinary intimacy, I began to understand that this slow, careful closeness, this shared space of subtle touches and lingering glances, was just the beginning of something I wanted, more than I could yet admit, to last. It was a quiet afternoon in the campus library when I saw her again, this time outside the lecture hall. She was seated at a corner table, a stack of books beside her, sunlight streaming across her face through the tall windows. There was something almost unreal about the way the light caught the subtle highlights in her hair, the calm concentration in her eyes as she flipped through a worn journal. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if approaching her outside of class felt proper, or dangerous, but the pull was irresistible. I walked over, careful not to appear intrusive. She looked up, surprise flickering across her face, quickly replaced by a welcoming warmth. "Oh, hi," she said softly, a smile curling the corners of her lips. Her voice had the same gentle authority as in class, yet there was a personal softness to it now, a quiet invitation to linger. I cleared my throat, and we fell into an easy conversation about literature, sharing opinions on favorite authors and overlooked passages in novels. It felt intimate, like we were discovering each other in a new way, without the rigid structure of lectures or assignments. At one point, a loose strand of hair fell across her face, and I instinctively reached forward to tuck it behind her ear. Our fingers brushed lightly, a fleeting contact that sent warmth up my arm and left a strange fluttering in my chest. She caught my glance and didn't pull away. Instead, there was a softness in her eyes, an unspoken acknowledgement that made the air between us feel charged yet safe. She shared a small, personal anecdote, a memory from her own college days, a moment of vulnerability I hadn't seen in class. The story revealed a side of her I'd never noticed, quietly human, tender, with a hint of longing hidden beneath her composed exterior. I listened, captivated not just by her words but by the cadence of her voice, the way her hands moved gently as she spoke, the subtle expressions that passed across her face in brief flashes. As the library grew quieter with the afternoon sun, our conversation naturally slowed, and there was a moment of silence that felt full rather than empty. I noticed the warmth radiating from her presence, the faint perfume lingering in the air, the light pressure of her hand resting near mine on the table. In that shared quiet, I realized that the connection wasn't just in words or gestures, it was in the attention we gave each other, in the delicate closeness that was building without us forcing it. When we finally parted, she gave a small, lingering smile, and I felt the gentle pull of something unspoken, something quietly thrilling. Outside the classroom, the walls of propriety still existed, but in that moment, it felt as though the world had briefly contracted, leaving just the two of us suspended in a shared, fragile intimacy. The weeks that followed brought a subtle shift. I found myself looking forward to lectures with a mix of anticipation and anxiety, my mind constantly aware of her presence. Each time I slid into my usual seat closer to her, I felt the warmth radiating from her as if the air itself had thickened around us. And yet, there was a growing tension in my chest, a knot of hesitation and guilt I couldn't quite untangle. How could I, a 24-year-old student, feel this pull toward a woman whose life experience was so far beyond mine? During one discussion, a debate about a complex passage in a novel brought us unusually close. As she leaned over to clarify a point, our shoulders brushed, a light contact that lingered longer than necessary. My heart raced, but I forced myself to focus on the text, even as our eyes met and held for a fraction of a second too long. There was a quiet electricity in that touch, but it was tempered by the awareness of boundaries and the silent, unspoken rules we were navigating. Outside the classroom, the weight of social perception added another layer. Walking through campus, I noticed the curious glances of peers, whispers that seemed amplified when we passed. Each smile she offered, each gentle touch on my arm, was tempered by a careful grace, a subtle assertion that she would not cross lines recklessly. My own inner conflict mirrored hers, admiration and longing intertwined with respect, hesitation, and a lingering sense of impropriety. One afternoon, she confided in me quietly after class, her voice unusually soft. She spoke of her own past regrets, the moments when desire had clashed with responsibility, and the lessons she'd learned about patience and timing. I listened, captivated not just by the story but by the vulnerability she allowed herself to show. It struck me that her composed exterior was a shield, one that I was slowly invited behind, piece by piece, through trust and careful attention. The tension between us became a quiet undercurrent, felt more than spoken. A brush of fingers, a prolonged glance, a smile that lingered, it was all charged, restrained, and intimate. Each moment left me more aware of the gap between desire and propriety, between longing and respect. Yet it was in this very restraint that our connection deepened, growing into something delicate, electric, and profoundly human. By the end of that week, I realized that what drew me to her wasn't simply attraction, it was the careful, measured intimacy that existed in shared glances, whispered words, and fleeting touches. And though the conflict remained, the possibility of something real, tender, and slow-burning had begun to take root. It started with a casual invitation, one I hadn't anticipated but secretly longed for. After class, she suggested grabbing a coffee at a small cafe tucked just off campus. The moment felt private, almost fragile, as though the world had briefly slowed to make space for just the two of us. The air was cool with a soft autumn breeze, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and faint hints of coffee from nearby shops. I noticed the subtle sway of her scarf around her neck, the gentle way her hand wrapped around her cup as she took a sip. It was ordinary, yet charged with meaning. We found a quiet corner, and the conversation began casually, books, professors, the usual chatter, but it didn't stay casual for long. She shared memories I hadn't expected, stories from her life before I'd met her, moments of regret and quiet longing that revealed a side of her I'd never seen in class. Her voice had a softness then, a timbre that seemed to invite trust and quiet intimacy. I listened, careful not to interrupt, noticing the way her eyes reflected the light from the window, and the subtle tremor in her hands as she spoke of things she rarely revealed. At one point, a strand of her hair fell across her face, and I reached out instinctively, tucking it behind her ear. My fingers brushed her cheek ever so lightly, a fleeting contact that sent warmth up my arm and made my heart tighten. She didn't pull away. Instead, she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, a brief acknowledgement that left the air between us charged yet safe. It was the kind of touch that spoke volumes without words, a quiet permission to be closer, to notice, to care. The cafe's soft hum of conversation faded into the background as we continued to talk. Our bodies leaned subtly toward each other, shoulders occasionally brushing, hands moving just close enough to feel the presence of the other without crossing a line. I realized then that intimacy wasn't always in grand gestures, it was in the way she listened, the way she allowed herself to be seen, the way small touches and lingering glances conveyed more than words ever could. By the time we left, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the street. We walked side by side, the silence between us no longer awkward but tender, filled with unspoken understanding. I felt it then, an awareness of the growing connection, a bond built from trust, vulnerability, and the slow, deliberate closeness we were both allowing. There was desire, yes, but tempered by care, respect, and a quiet yearning that promised something deeper, something real. In that afternoon, ordinary and fleeting as it seemed, I understood that the slow burn of our connection wasn't just attraction, it was the unhurried discovery of each other, in every glance, every word, every carefully measured touch. It was one of those evenings when the campus seemed to exhale, a quiet calm settling over empty paths and dimly lit walkways. She suggested walking together after a late study session, and I followed, aware of how my chest tightened with each step closer to her. The trees lining the path rustled gently in the autumn breeze, leaves crunching softly beneath our feet. The world felt suspended, as if it existed just for the two of us. Conversation was light at first, comments about the lecture, about upcoming assignments, but beneath the casual words, something unspoken simmered. I noticed the subtle shift in her gait, the way her hand occasionally brushed mine, almost imperceptibly. Each accidental touch lingered a moment longer than necessary, and the warmth it left on my skin seemed to spread through me, making the air heavier, charged with tension. At a small clearing, she paused, looking up at the canopy of golden leaves overhead. Her eyes were softer than usual, contemplative, and I felt a wave of vulnerability radiate from her presence. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable but intimate, as though it were a shared space we both instinctively respected. My mind raced with questions I wasn't ready to ask aloud, but her quiet confidence gave me courage. Finally, she spoke, not about literature, not about life lessons, but about fear. About connection, about longing, about the weight of choices we didn't yet dare make. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the vulnerability she usually kept hidden behind poised composure. I found myself instinctively reaching for her hand, brushing my fingers along hers, not fully holding it, but close enough to feel the pulse beneath her skin, a tender rhythm that mirrored my own heartbeat. The tension peaked, a delicate balance of desire and restraint. She didn't move away, I didn't pull closer. Yet the air between us was taut with possibility. My words came quietly, carefully, I don't want to rush this, but I don't want to let it slip away either. She looked at me, eyes reflecting the fading sunlight, and nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture that carried the weight of unspoken agreement. We walked the rest of the path side by side, shoulders brushing lightly, hands occasionally close enough to sense warmth without contact. In that shared quiet, I realized something profound. Desire was no longer the urgent pull of mere attraction, it was a careful, mutual acknowledgement of trust, intimacy, and the courage to face what our hearts quietly demanded. By the time we parted for the night, there was no dramatic confession, no impulsive gesture, just a lingering gaze, a soft smile, and the unspoken promise that this slow, careful connection, tender and electric, was no longer a fleeting possibility. It was real, and it was ours to explore together. The week after our quiet evening walk, the rhythm of our connection felt more natural, more deliberate. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Our closeness had grown through small, intentional acts, each one carrying meaning that neither of us needed to explain. That afternoon, she invited me to meet her in the quiet alcove of the campus library, a space tucked away from the usual hustle, where sunlight streamed through tall windows and dust motes floated lazily in the golden light. As I approached, I noticed the gentle curve of her smile before she even spoke, the way her eyes lit with warmth as if welcoming me into a shared secret. The distance between us felt smaller than ever, yet the unspoken boundaries remained intact, a testament to mutual respect and care. We sat side by side, the edges of our chairs close enough that our knees occasionally brushed, sending sparks of quiet thrill through me. The conversation drifted naturally, from light humor to reflections on recent lectures, to the subtle confession of fears and hopes. She let herself be vulnerable in ways I hadn't seen before, pauses where her gaze softened, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup absent-mindedly, shoulders relaxing into my space as if testing the waters of trust. I mirrored her openness, sharing thoughts and feelings I had kept guarded, discovering in the process that our emotional intimacy had become the foundation of something deeper than attraction alone. At one point, her hand moved slightly, resting near mine. I didn't reach out immediately, but the warmth of her presence against my skin was undeniable. Slowly, naturally, our fingers brushed, then intertwined. It was a deliberate, gentle contact, full of meaning yet entirely YouTube safe, a quiet affirmation of trust, affection, and the bond we had nurtured. Her hand felt steady, reassuring, her subtle squeeze speaking louder than words ever could. We leaned back, shoulders touching lightly, and shared a soft, lingering gaze. In that moment, the tension that had built over weeks resolved into warmth, a quiet, fulfilling intimacy that required neither words nor dramatic gestures. The air around us felt alive with possibility, yet grounded in patience, respect, and deep emotional connection. When we finally rose to leave, she let me walk beside her a few steps, and as we parted at the library's entrance, our fingers slipped apart slowly, deliberately, leaving a sense of promise in their wake. There was no rush, no need for sudden confessions, our journey had been slow, deliberate, and meaningful. As I walked away, I realized that the slow burn of our connection, our lingering glances, our shared silences, our gentle touches, had grown into something real, tender, and enduring. It was a love born not of impulse but of patience, trust, and the quiet courage to let hearts meet on their own careful terms. And for the first time, I felt certain that this story, delicate and restrained as it had been, had found its perfect, warm resolution. If you felt the slow burn of this story, don't forget to like and share it with someone who loves a quiet, heartfelt romance. Subscribe and hit the bell to follow more age gap romance stories, where every glance and every touch tells a deeper story. Comment below, what moment in the story made your heart skip a beat?